What's up, everyone, and welcome to MintCast, the official podcast of Mint Press News. I'm your host, Mnar Adley, founder and director of Mint Press. Now, as 2025 begins, it seems like the entire world is on fire. From political turmoil across the West, slaughter and regime change across the Middle East, and a new Cold War brewing with China. Everywhere we look seems to be filled with uncertainty. And here in the U.S., California itself is ravaged by literal fires in a show of failure of our capitalist society. Joining us today to discuss this and more is Vijay Prashad. Vijay is a historian, journalist, and the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute. He's also the author of over 40 books, including his most recent On Cuba, Reflections on 70 Years of Revolution and Struggle, which he co-wrote with Noam Chomsky. It's an honor to have you here with us, Vijay.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
So before we get started, I want to remind our listeners and viewers that this show is 100% funded by you. After an organized campaign to target Mint Press financially, we were banned by PayPal and had our fundraisers taken down by GoFundMe. Because of this, we rely heavily on our readers, viewers, and listeners to support our work. So please join us on Patreon today. So just to get started, Vijay, the world seems it is on fire, but California is literally on fire as we speak. As wildfires rip through Los Angeles, facing the blaze are underpaid and understaffed fire departments filled with prison laborers risking their lives for a few dollars. And on top of that, thousands of Los Angeles homeowners were dropped by their insurers before the fires even began. So what exactly does this say about our system, Vijay, and about American exceptionalism in general?
It's a catastrophe, and it should reveal something, but it won't. I mean, that's the real tragedy, is that I don't think there'll be space in the culture of the United States or other places to have a serious debate and discussion where this is allowed to reveal something about the hollowness of the system. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the culture is going to permit itself a look into the mirror. I think instead, this is going to be a story of a million tragedies. And then at the end of it, the government is going to produce some support, and then it'll be to some extent forgotten. But I think the one area where the forgetting is going to be hard is the fact that so many celebrities have lost their homes. And they do have a microphone bigger than ordinary people. If this fire had taken place in a poor neighborhood, let's say in Ohio, it would be very quickly forgotten. But the one thing that makes this difference is that a number of people from Hollywood lost their homes, and they have a megaphone, which I don't think they're going to allow run silent.
And it's interesting how the media has given them actually a bigger voice than the locals that are being ravaged by the fires, indeed. So one of the things that we want to talk about today, and I don't mean to switch gears from California off to the Middle East, but we want to talk a little bit about what's happening in Syria. Let's switch to Syria and the Middle East more generally. Assad is out and Jalani is in as the new president. The United States and the West more generally have no secret of their approval of this. Of course, they were part of, his rise, despite Jalani's past as the founder of Al-Qaeda in Syria. How does this change in government change the balance in power in the region?
I mean, this is a serious catastrophe for human affairs, in my opinion. And let me explain a little bit what I mean. In late December, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, gave a speech where he said, remember that a year ago, that is in 2023, he said, I told you, Netanyahu, not me, I told you that the Palestinians will be different, they'll be changed, Lebanon will be different, Syria will be different, and he said, I was right. What this made me reflect when I first listened to the speech, watched the transcript, read it carefully, what it made me realize was that the Israelis have actually done something pretty confounding in the short term, which is they have seriously weakened the resistance against the occupation of the Palestinians. Firstly, it is true that the scale of the bombardment on the Palestinians in Gaza. It's unparalleled scale of bombardment. The wreckage that they have left behind, building upon building destroyed, has severely weakened Hamas. I mean, not only have they damaged Hamas's command and control by killing its leadership across one, two, three levels of leadership, but the sheer wreckage they've left in Gaza has meant that Hamas's infrastructure has also been deeply weakened. Now, this doesn't mean that it won't be rebuilt. This doesn't mean that new resistance forces won't arise. But for now, Hamas has been deeply weakened. Secondly, in the middle of all this, the Israelis decided, with full backing from the United States, to go after Hezbollah. And this included, of course, the assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut, with a giant attack on Nasrallah's, where he had been in this 8-story building. It was an enormous attack, enormous crater now there in Beirut. And then the bombardment of the villages, sustained bombardment of the villages south of the Litani River, where Hezbollah's military capacity has been seriously weakened. Then, thirdly, Israel, almost without much media coverage, began to hammer the Syrian military right through last year, hammering the Syrian military from the air, hitting military bases, bombing the intelligence building in Damascus, bombing military targets for command and control in Damascus, attacking Iranian positions that were within Syria, attacking Iranian, including embassy personnel and so on. This sustained bombardment demoralized and weakened the Syrian military. In a sense, the Israeli Air Force provided air cover for Mr. Jolani and Hayat Tahrir al-Shams to come down from Idlib and seize Damascus. In all of this, in a way, in a very short period of time, what the Israelis have done is in fact unraveled what Qasem Soleimani had built up, which was a first line of defense for Iran. Mr. Soleimani, who was assassinated by the Americans in Baghdad, had built up this line of defense for Iran, that if Israel and the United States tried to attack Iran, they would face some pretty serious, resistance from proximity to Israel, from Hezbollah, from groups inside Syria, from Hamas and others. Well, now neither Hamas nor Hezbollah have the ability to seriously attack Israel. And Mr. Jolani has publicly said he is not going to permit an attack on Israel from inside Syria. In fact, he's allowed the Israelis to take the entire UN buffer zone, which means that both the Israelis and the United States have almost now a clear run to bomb Iran. This is something that really worries me a lot, that, the Israelis see the weakening of, the forces of resistance in Lebanon, Syria, and in Gaza in particular. They see the weakening of this resistance as an open door to slam Iran. In fact, again, very poorly reported, two different important things to mention. Number one, in October of last year, October 2024, the Israelis actually struck a number of factories and academic institutions in Iran, including factories that built short-range ballistic missiles, the sort of missiles that Hezbollah had been using against Israel. The Israelis attacked this factory inside Iran, not far from Tehran, very poorly reported. Secondly, the other incident that's important to put on the table is that the Iranian foreign minister made a public statement saying Iran is ready to negotiate, to come back to the table, completely ignored by the West. Iran is in a very perilous situation because the Trump administration could at any point begin a big military assault on Iran from the air. Nobody's saying they're going to try to occupy Iranian land. But this would be catastrophic for Iranian civilization. And I think your viewers should take this quite seriously, that the threat of a full-scale aerial attack by the Israelis and Americans on Iran is not out of the bounds right now.
Yeah, I mean, with the Trump administration having not drained the swamp, having the very people, the very neoconservatives surround him who want regime change in Iran, I mean, it's without a question that it is very much a possibility. In fact, I mean, it was the Trump administration who assassinated Qasem Soleimani. And so it was almost like the Biden administration had kind of set everything up for the Trump administration to continue the U.S. imperialist agenda for the region. We have Anthony Blinken expressing his satisfaction with Assad's ouster and his replacement. And we've seen the conversation, even within like the leftist anti-war movement, people turning it into, was Assad good or bad? And I think that's completely an irrelevant conversation considering the geopolitics of the implications of this Julani government, Al-Qaeda basically taking power inside Syria. So as he leaves office, Blinken leaves office, he has claimed that because of the work we've done to bring countries together, we've advanced progress for people in America and around the world. But that's not how everybody in the global South sees him and Washington with all of these regime change war operations and supporting Israeli apartheid and occupation. More generally, so what is America's true role in the world today, and how does the global South, in your opinion, view the U.S.?
Well, I mean, it's obviously complicated because there are some elites in the South who are pretty happy with the United States. There are some elites in the Arab world who are pretty happy, that Hezbollah and Hamas and others have been weakened. It strengthens their position. They're looking at things perhaps also from the short term. The Turks are pretty happy. Mr. Erdogan has had it as his ambition to have a friendly government to Turkey in Damascus, which is going to permit Turkey to basically seize very large parts of northern Syria. The Turks have an idea that in northern Syria, the tomb of Suleiman Shah, the father of Ertugrul, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, that tomb should be part of Turkish soil, not part of Syria. They're going to seize that. That's without a question. The Turks have for eons considered Aleppo a Turkish city. And I think very likely at some point there's going to be a little bit of a debate and clash with the Turkish clients sitting in Damascus. Will they tolerate, Aleppo slipping into Turkish hands, being part of the Turkish universe? There will be all kinds of contradictions. So sections of the global South might be quite happy for short-term reasons with the Biden administration, with Blinken and so on. But in the long term, I don't think they should live in their dreamland. In the long term, they need to recognize that their interests are irrelevant to the United States, that the United States utilizes their short-term interests for its long-term interests. And that, I think, is key. To overthrow and destroy the government in Iran is not regime change. It will be civilizational change. They want to take Iran back to the 1953 period after the coup against Mossadegh, when Iran would have to submit to the United States. That's a civilizational change. The mentality of people in Iran is going to have to change. I don't think that's going to be possible, but that's what the US wants. The short-term gain of some people who might like that will not be a long-term gain for them. If Iran becomes subordinate to the United States, I don't think that's actually beneficial to Saudi Arabia. I think that would be a terrifying prospect to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is trying to establish itself as an independent country, independent of the United States, relations with China and so on. I don't think they want that either. That is the reason why the Saudis went to China, did the handshake agreement with the Iranians, a move which I think was shaking up the Middle East greatly. And in many ways, what the Israelis have done now is to break that dynamic of bringing the Saudis and the Iranians closer together. Because as the Saudis or section of the Saudi leadership sees Iran being weakened, they think, oh, it's a short-term gain for us, but it's a long-term defeat for you. It will be a strategic defeat for West Asia if there is a war of the kind that I think could happen against Iran. So in the global South, there are these mixed class realities. Some sections might see the short-term benefit. Others just don't see any benefit at all. Others will not see a benefit because, after all, what is the West providing for the world other than lectures, other than telling you can't ally with each other or trade with China and so on? I mean, the West has put very, very little on the table for countries that want to have development, that want to see their people advance. Just being told you got to stop using carbon is not a way forward. This is not happening even in Germany. The next thing the Germans are going to do to keep warm is burn down the Black Forest, because the most effective thing for them to do is to buy Russian gas, but that's not permitted right now, which is why Germany is in a political crisis. So Germany is itself not following the whole climate agenda, but the West is still lecturing other countries, saying you got to do this. What do they have to offer except lectures, threats, sanctions, and war? They're offering nothing other than that. So I would like just to say that there are some sections, we should not ignore them, that are quite happy to have a short-term gain with the Western intervention. But the majority of people don't see any gain. And I think one has to find a way to bring the majority of people into the conversation and have them have more power in their own societies. In the case of Western Asia, I mean, one would like to see more conversations taking place that are actually real conversations about what would this mean. I mean, the victory of Mr. Jolani in Damascus, maybe some people who don't understand the region think this is a great thing. But it is going to be, it is actually already pretty catastrophic for the Palestinian liberation movement, because the land bridge to Iran is gone. It's one thing to fantasize. You're sitting in the United States or in Canada, you have some fantasy idea that democracy. Assad has a prison. Assad has a prison. United States has more prisoners per capita than any country in the world. You want to free the prisons? Where are the journalists from CBS and so on running into U.S. prisons to interview, particularly black prisoners who have been political prisoners for decades, Mumia Abu Jamal and so on? Where are they? They are not concerned about the prisons. They're saying, well, there's this terrible prison in Syria. How many supermax prisons are there in the U.S.? Of course, the situation in Syria wasn't perfect, but certainly the loss of this land bridge for rearming the Palestinian resistance is going to be catastrophic for a very long time. So people need to get out of their purism and their fantasies and look at some of the hardball realities of the real world.
Absolutely. And it seems like there is an agreement. There is agreement within the United States, in Washington, that China is a threat to the world. And now with the Trump administration kind of pushing that narrative even further, because China's always been Trump's number one issue. Why are top politicians across the U.S. so obsessed with Beijing? What explains this?
Well, in fact, the US government should be obsessed with Beijing. It's a pretty important thing for the US government for good reason. Over the last, let's say, 50 years, the government in China has done something very clever, which other governments of the global south didn't do. What they did was they said, for market access, you have to transfer technology and science. We're not going to give you market access merely for, foreign direct investment. We don't need foreign direct investment like that. Most countries in the global south said, if you're bringing in investment, you can access our market, no problem. Chinese said, no. Market access is only going to come if you give us access to technology, show us how the tech works. In other words, science. We need that. We need tech and science for market access. Otherwise, you're not entering our markets. Okay. Western companies and countries eager to get into the Chinese market said, fine. Here's how we do high-speed rail. Here's how we do semiconductors. Here's how we do green technology. Let us use your labor. Let us, access your market. So for decades, the West was really happy. China was making everything. The West was getting goods that were at a cheaper price, and the West was sharing technology. Meanwhile, the Chinese were looking at this technology saying, this is interesting. They're making this train like this with these kind of magnets, I think, this is a Japanese technology. We could put this together with the French thing. We improve it. We, rewire things. We create a better train system, and then boom, they've created a train that can go 3 times as fast as the fastest high-speed rail in the US. They've improved the telecommunication systems. Their phones produced by Huawei and Honor and other companies, as good, if not better, than any phone produced by US companies. Suddenly, they are contesting Western capitalism, where Western capitalism thought it was going to be eternally ahead, which was in technology. And they produce third, fourth, fifth generation of technology. You're talking about 3G, 4G. They are already planning 6, 7G tools. They are far ahead of where the West is. You travel in China, Mnar, you go to rural areas, mountainous areas, amazing 5D connectivity. I've never had a problem in China. You're on a train in the middle of nowhere, you got 5G, no problem. Their connectivity is incredible. And so they can sell this around the world for way cheaper than any US company, because their profit structure is different. They don't need to produce gazillionaires who own islands and have private planes and so on. They don't need to produce that level of profit. Their products are way cheaper, so they are wiping out Western companies from the market. That's what's behind the new Cold War. The West has got a good point. They should be afraid. The model of private sector profit for social labor is not working against what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese are being very clever with how they are producing goods and services. They're not allowing companies to harvest profits. They are forcing companies to reinvest their profits into research and development, into infrastructure. I mean, in the West, for instance, private companies simply don't build infrastructure. They rely on the state to build infrastructure. But then private companies also don't pay taxation. So who's going to pay for the infrastructure? It's not getting built. This is a tangible existential threat to the West. Rather than take this seriously, fix the economy, don't allow private sector profits to be so enormous, force the private sector to invest in infrastructure and so on. Rather than follow the Chinese on that path, they want to bomb the Chinese into second position. They think the only way is to threaten the Chinese, to sanction them, to bomb them, to use tariffs. This is confrontation instead of economics. If the West really believed in free market economics, then they would actually improve the economy. But they don't. What they believe is gangsterism. And to put it quite plainly, whether it's Trump or Biden or Obama, or whoever it is, they are all gangsters when it comes to protecting their economic multinational corporations. They are gangsters in their behavior. They are not turning to the multinationals and saying, hey, make better products. Instead, they are saying, it's okay, we're going to defend you against any rival that appears in the marketplace, and we're going to defend you with our guns. Apple, you don't worry. Apple products should be made by Chinese laborers, but Apple should get all the profit. That's the system that they liked. That's no longer the system. The world has changed. It's just that the West hasn't caught up with those changes.
And it absolutely sounds like gangsters to me that are bullying the world. So as China, advances in these, technological developments, where do you see China's role moving forward in the 21st century?
Well, the first and most important thing is that we need to prevent an escalation of conflict between China and the United States. I mean, the United States very cleverly pushed a confrontation with Russia, which then developed into a full-scale war. When Germany was reuniting, at the time the United States dealing with the Soviet Union, and the Germans agreed with the US-Soviet handshake agreement that NATO would not go east of the East German border. That means NATO was not going to expand into Eastern Europe. That was an agreement. Well, after the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO went right up to the Russian border. Two countries in the Baltics joined NATO. Several other countries applied to join NATO, and so on. When Mr. Putin came in and began to revive the Russian economy, which had collapsed after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was a disastrous collapse. When Mr. Putin started to revive things and started to take back under state control, particularly energy reserves, he made it clear that Ukraine would not be permitted to join NATO, partly because they were afraid that the United States would place mid-range nuclear missiles in Ukraine, and those would be able to hit Moscow and St. Petersburg without any warning, basically. There was no reaction time possible because of the proximity of these cities to the Ukrainian border. Also, the Russians were concerned that the port in Sebastopol was basically one of their major warm water ports. And if Ukraine joined NATO, that would become a NATO port. This was a fear. And so they made it very clear. Well, the West continued to push. The West engineered a change of government in 2014, egging on the Russians into the conflict. The Russians, at several occasions, said they wanted to negotiate a security deal. West declined, pushed Russia into a conflict, and then Russia invades Ukraine in February of 2022. Well, the Chinese have watched this very carefully. They don't necessarily agree that Russia should have invaded Ukraine in 2022. In fact, China criticized that. But they are watching what's happening. There is a Ukraine in East Asia, that is Taiwan. The West has been egging China on by putting Taiwan into this position of basically breaking with the West's own understanding that there's one China and Beijing is the capital. Even the West doesn't recognize Taiwan as a country when it comes to the United Nations. Taiwan doesn't sit in the UN. Beijing sits in the UN on behalf of a united China. This is a conflict that goes back to 1949, to the revolution, when the Kuomintang fled the mainland and went to Formosa. At the time, there was a conflict which the United States got into to defend its allies, which had been defeated on the Chinese mainland. The Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek were in Formosa, which now is called Taiwan. It's called the Formosa Straits Dispute. The U.S. enters almost militarily in the 1950s to protect the Kuomintang. This is a very old dispute. The Chinese are fully aware of this. But the U.S. has been prodding and poking and threatening to put mid-range nuclear missiles into Taiwan, to bring Taiwan into closer military alliance with the US. All of this is a provocation against China. And I very much am sympathetic to the fact that the Chinese have not fallen for these provocations. I applaud them for that. I very much hope there will be no shooting war in the South China Sea, that somehow everybody holds their guard and waits till sober minds prevail, because there is nothing good that can come from a war between China and the United States. Nothing good. The United States knows that it's an enormous matter of national honor and pride for the Chinese to have Taiwan as part of China. It's a part of their understanding of who they are. It's a little bit like if, in Canada, if the Canadians were to cede Quebec. I think this would be an enormous loss for Canada, which is why the Canadians put so much effort to prevent the secession of Quebec. Or indeed, it's like Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. It's an enormous blow to the idea of Great Britain. Similarly, Taiwan is an enormously important part of the Chinese imagination. In fact, the government in Taipei, in Taiwan, thinks that it is the government of all China, that in fact it should govern all of China. That was what the Kuomintang thought when they went to Taipei. They were not saying we are just this island. So, this idea of one China is there on all sides. And I'm very happy that no provocation has led to a shooting match yet. But I would say that that's a great worry to me. And I hope that that the West comes to an understanding that, look, the Chinese have a right to develop. You can't bomb them back into an earlier economic stage. I think that's exactly what is written in the documents of the US military. They write directly that you confront China because it poses an economic threat to the United States, and that cannot be allowed. I mean, that's ridiculous. China is a threat to nobody. Like, this idea that China is threatening its neighbors is ridiculous. The only country that has threatened and invaded other countries in recent times is the United States. And Russia, of course, invades Ukraine. But China has invaded nobody. You know, even, you know, somebody can say, yes, but they are occupying Tibet and Xinjiang and so on. Let's have a discussion about that. Quite happy to. Neither of them are a straightforward invasion like the United States invaded Iraq. China is not a threat to other countries. They have not they have developed a defensive military capacity. If we look in our institute at world military spending, of total global military spending, the United States and its NATO allies account for 74.3% of global military spending. China accounts for 10%. Russia accounts for 3%. How is China a threat when you compare it to the US and the NATO countries? They are the genuine threat to world peace.
The biggest threats to world peace are, of course, the United States and NATO. We've seen that, as you said, in the last, nearly decade, or not decade, nearly century of US warfare and occupations and genocides and bloodshed that has taken place all across the world. And of course, we can't forget the role that the United Kingdom has played also in Taiwan as well. I want to talk a little bit about the sanctions against China and even Russia. The United States has tried to use sanctions against China and Russia, but have had little success in actually drowning those economies. We've got the TikTok ban, the tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and the semiconductor war seem not to be actually working. Yet the United States has indeed crushed smaller countries around the world with sanctions. And with the rise of BRICS, economic bloc, and more trading options, is the power of the US to carry out economic warfare around the world waning?
Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's waning, but let's start with China and sanctions. I mean, firstly, China is a country of 1.4 billion people. It has a vast internal market, an enormous amount of pent-up demand. In other words, it can produce for its own market, doesn't really rely on exporting as the only way to go. And plus, China exports in its neighborhood, you know, right through Central Asia to the rest of Southeast Asia. It's an enormous market in Southeast Asia. China doesn't require the United States per se. You know, it has found other arenas for its goods and services. So there's that. Also, you know, it's true that the ban on certain kinds of chips and so on hurt China quite a lot. But they have a resilient economy. They are able to catch things up. They are very quickly producing microchips, very quickly producing things that they don't have access to. But it does hurt. I mean, they have relied a lot on the import of certain technologies. And as these technologies are taken away from the Chinese economy and as they seek substitutes, it takes time. That puts them, that slows things down for them. I wouldn't say that it has had no impact. It has had an impact, but it's not catastrophic. This is not a small country that you can garrote so easily. Secondly, you're right. It's something to do with the BRICS as well, but also it has to do with the self-interest of countries. You know, India is a country of 1.4 billion, cannot afford to stop buying Russian oil. It's a fact that India, if it bought oil at the premium market cost in Saudi Arabia and other countries, there would be enormous inflation in the country. They are getting discounted oil from the Russians. You know, that's just going to be there. I mean, you know, right-wing government, left-wing government, doesn't matter. You cannot afford to allow high inflation in your country that might lead to mass starvation and so on. People can't afford to buy food. So India has to break the barrier against Russia for practical national reasons, not even the BRICS. It actually has to do it to maintain its own country going. Yeah. But the BRICS does play a role here because it does turn out that these countries are affiliated to one another through this bloc. The bloc itself hasn't produced as much as it could. Its own institutions haven't developed as fast as they should have. The financial institutions, the various institutions to transfer money and so on, these have all been very much slowed down for a host of institutional reasons. But these countries also have their own interests at stake. and they just can't afford to break with each other. I mean, that's just a fact. Like Australia, take Australia. It's a better example in a way. Australia is a country in the Five Eyes intelligence network with the United States, super close ally of the US, just conducted the AUKUS deal. They had the ANZUS treaty with the US and New Zealand, 1951, which is one of the first security treaties after the NATO pact was signed in 1959. It's a very old ally of the United States. Who's the major trading partner of Australia? China. Australia is pledged to be part of the US pressure campaign against China, but cannot economically break with China. If tomorrow Australia decided we are not going to trade with China, the Australian economy will shut down. There are no substitutes. And nobody is going to be able to buy the minerals and metals that Australia exports except China. Nobody. Nobody has the capacity to absorb it. The economy will collapse. So these internal contradictions are really very important to bear in mind. You can't just look at things in terms of who's allied with whom. Japan has a very important energy deal with the Russian government up in the Irkutsk Peninsula. This has made the situation extremely hard for Japan. Japan is a G7 member. Japan is extremely close to the US. It's not a member of NATO, but might as well be. It has the Treaty of San Francisco that links it militarily to the US, also in the 1950s. But Japan, during this break with Russia, when everybody's broken, has had a hard time because they have this enormous energy project in the Irkutsk Peninsula with the Russians, which it just cannot walk away from. It's the salvation of Japan's economy. They buy oil from Saudi Arabia. It's extremely expensive. It comes by sea. This is energy right there on the other side of a narrow inlet of water. They've been able to reduce the energy cost dramatically. So these contradictions are creating a problem for the United States and its allies. And by the way, contradictions should be a possibility for human beings. It should give us something to advance our needs, and instead they are using contradictions as a weapon to divide people. And I think that comes to the heart of it. I want to live on a planet where people are not being divided, but are being brought together. And I think that's a lesson the West needs to learn.
And that's a very good point. One place that has indeed felt the brunt of U.S. sanctions is the small island of Cuba. Your new book on Cuba, Reflections on 70 Years of Revolution and Struggle, which you co-wrote with Noam Chomsky, looks at Cuba and its history. What is it about that small island that interests you so much?
Well, firstly, Cuba is the defiant island of defiant islands. I mean, in the book, and thanks for mentioning the book, because it meant a lot to me to do this with Noam Chomsky. We come from different political paradigms in a sense, but we have a great agreement on human freedom and human dignity, and particularly the importance of human freedom and dignity of people of the global South. Noam is a passionate champion. During the war against the people of Vietnam, he went to North Vietnam. This is something people don't know much about. He, in fact, taught in Hanoi during the bombings. He gave a series of lectures on anything people wanted to know about what's happening in the West. That's how it's remembered. People would shout out, "What's Norman Mailer's new book like?" And he would have to explain, because they had no contact with what was happening in the Western Academy. He lectured on biology, on chemistry, on new findings in linguistics, of course, his field. He went to the Plain of Jars in Cambodia. He's been a real defender of the people of the South against imperialism his entire life, and as I say, physically, putting himself on the line. He went to Beirut, traveled to the south of Lebanon, saw the situation there, wrote about it, wrote a very moving book with his then wife, Carol Chomsky, and so on. Anyway, it was a pleasure to work on this with him. The book is interesting because we had a very long series of conversation, and through it, we kept coming to bits and pieces of debate and discussion. And I want to say that the area of the book that I was most interested in working on was the area around the comparison between Haiti and Cuba. And the reason is because these are, in a way, two parallel islands in the Caribbean. Haiti had a great revolution in 1804. This is the first slave plantation to overthrow slavery, led by the enslaved people themselves. They overthrew the rule of the planter. They created a republic. The republic was then crushed by the French, by the United States, their allies. They joined together to crush the republic. Imagine this. This is just after the French Revolution. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. It's just after the U.S. Revolution, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in a way, these two so-called white societies, white supremacist societies, saw it was liberty, equality, fraternity for themselves, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness for themselves, but not for people from Africa who were to be second-class citizens. So they tried to crush that revolution from 1804 onwards. And then later, as the Haitians kept trying to push their agenda forward, they kept getting suffocated. The United States invades Haiti several times. In 1957, there's a counter-revolution in Haiti in 1957, led by a man called Papadoc Duvalier. He crushed all dissent. He crushed all dissent. He subordinated the people of Haiti. He allowed U.S. multinational corporations free hand in his country, and he devastated the country. His son, who followed, Baby Doc Duvalier, father and son ran a death squad in the country, killing all opponents. This is a hugely well-documented story from 1957. 2 years after the Haitian counter-revolution, there was the Cuban Revolution. Now, it's very interesting. The West attacked the Cuban Revolution, saying that it suffocated dissent. Why? Because it threw out Western multinationals and wanted to build a sovereign Cuba. So Haiti, which actually suffocated dissent, where actually there was a death squad going around killing people, was treated as a free country. And Cuba, where the people were freed from the oppression of the Batista Revolution, was treated as an unfree country. This comparison is very interesting. And today, even though Haiti is quote unquote free and Cuba is within the bounds of the Cuban Revolution, Cuba, heavily sanctioned for 70 years, heavily sanctioned by the United States. The conditions of life, despite the sanctions in Cuba, are better for an average Cuban than they are for an average Haitian. That comparison to me tells you a lot. If there were no sanctions on Cuba, what would the situation be? If Haiti had been allowed to survive, if the revolution of 1804 had been where would Haiti be today? And my message to the US government is, if you believe, as you keep saying, that the sanctions are not what creates the problems in Cuba, the problem is the government, then lift the sanction, lift the embargo, lift the blockade, stop the blockade. If you don't believe the blockade is destroying the country, lift the blockade. Let's test the government. Let's see how long it will survive without the government. You can't have it both ways. You can't say that we need a blockade, and in fact, what's ruining Cuba is the government. No, the blockade is what's harming the Cuban people. Lift the blockade. Let's test it. Let's do it for 10 years, put it to the test. They won't even risk it. Even Obama wouldn't risk it, because they don't want to see a revolution succeed in their backyard, because a defiant revolution is contagious. It'll give everybody ideas.
Vijay, we've learned so much from you today. It's always an honor to listen to you, to get your perspective. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks a lot. Anytime.